Good evening and good afternoon. Welcome to our program on Catholic faith, society and culture. And today we have a great privilege to host Stefano Gennarini, a senior member of CFAM, which is organization dealing with the United Nations, defending human dignity, a pro-life voice in the international fora. Stefano is a doctor of law. He's an experienced lawyer, and he's actively involved in various discussions in the United Nations and other organizations. Stefano, warm welcome in our program.
Thank you, Piotr.
Today, we will be discussing a number of important issues which will have, or already have a significant impact on many countries. What's going on in the United States has leverage on many countries, including Poland, including Europe. This program is sponsored by the AWTN Poland, Christian Center for Culture of Mary, our Queen, Lay Catholic Association Przybądźcie Wierni, and we hope that this would be also opportunity for our viewers to enjoy some important information. I will be running this show with my colleague Zbigniew Przybyłowski, who is with us, and also we are also with Łukasz Mirosław, who is supporting us, and Szczepan Bartoszko of the EWTN, who is providing us IT support. Following our custom, I'd like to invite you to say a short prayer with me before this meeting. This is our Father in Latin, and I would like to invite you to ask God for the peace in the world. We live in a very difficult period in neighboring country, Ukraine. We've got heavy fights and people are dying. So and also we had this thunders, earthquakes in Syria and Turkey. There is many suffering in the world. So let's pray good God for his support and his grace. Pater noster, quies in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo,
quotidiano da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et non nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. And let me pass the floor to Zbigniew, who used to make always introduction in our interviews. So Zbigniew, the floor is yours.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Good evening, Stefano. Let me first ask you a couple of questions about yourself, how you got to where you are. Tell us a few things about your life journey. How did you get to where you are? To be, a primary personage in the battle for freedom of conscience, for religious freedom and pro-life causes in the United Nations and throughout the world, I guess. And if you could also add a little bit of color of how does the Catholic faith feature in that? How did it shape you?
Well, I wanted to be a priest from when I was very young, about 17 years old. And I was just very struck by many priests who I was very impressed with and their witness. And I wanted to imitate that. So I went off to seminary when I was 18. And after almost 7 years training to be a priest, I realized it wasn't for me. And so I went to law school after studying theology and philosophy, which I was very grateful for in any case, because it gave me a real grounding in the faith. And I went to law school, and when I was at law school, I thought, I have many options in front of me. And the last thing I prepared for was international human rights law. In American law schools, international law and human rights law in particular are viewed with a lot of skepticism. So it didn't seem like anybody really took it very seriously. But when I graduated from law school, I had the opportunity to do an internship with CFAM. And I happened to arrive at CFAM at a time when all the previous staff had moved on to other things. And I was left as the only lawyer at CFAM. And, within 6 months, I was hired by my boss, Austin, to do the job. So I was very grateful. I think I was talking to an intern, in fact, earlier today, a possible intern who will come to us. I think early on when I was in law school, what was in front of me was the option of sort of hiding my faith, my convictions in order to advance professionally, or to find a place to work where I can openly profess what I believe to be true. And I simply have been blessed to be able to work at a place where my faith and what I do professionally coincide in every way.
Okay, and so could you tell us a little bit about the story of CFAM? So what is this organization? What does it do? How does it view its role? And what kind of themes does it work with?
So CFAM was founded in the 1990s following the call of Pope St. John Paul the Great for Catholics to become more involved in international debates, because, as you may recall, in the 1990s, there were several major UN conferences on topics like women, population and development, the environment, and social development, human rights. And there were many conferences in the 1990s. It was right after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. And so there was this great push for global cooperation on promotion of democracy and human rights, women's issues, etc. And Pope John Paul the Great realized that there was need for Catholics to be involved full time in this debate. And he would, even from the general audiences in St. Peter's Squares, he would call for people to go to Cairo or go to Beijing to the UN conferences. And inevitably what happened was that all these people would show up, all these Catholics would show up at these conferences, but they would try to do something. But by the time they got to the conference, all the damage was done. The preparatory work for the conference was done. Much of the negotiations had already taken place. And so the ability of the Catholics to influence and impact the debate had already been severely limited. And so because of that, Cardinal Martino, who was the nuncio here in New York, suggested to some donors that it would be important to have a permanent presence of Catholics at the United Nations to alert Catholics worldwide more broadly about what was happening at the United Nations and to monitor the debate on life and family issues here at the United Nations. And so that's how CFAM was founded. It was initially founded with some seed money from donors related to Human Life International, who you might be familiar with, and eventually it just took on a life of its own. And we've been reporting what happens at the United Nations on life and family issues since 1997, when we were founded, as well as participating in UN negotiations. We've been, CFAM experts have been at every major UN social policy debate since the 1990s, including the Cairo and the Beijing conferences. So we have a great institutional memory that we can draw upon, which helps us a lot. Because, as you may know, here at the United Nations, as with government in general, there's always term limits to government positions. So even the diplomats that come to New York, they come for 3 years sometimes. At most, they'll be around for 6 years. And so they're at a great disadvantage with respect to the permanent bureaucracy at the United Nations who keep the agenda and the organization functioning. So we help to counter that by providing a different kind of institutional memory.
Okay. And so you were with CFAM from what point in time? CFAM started in 97. When did you join there?
In 2011. I came to CFAM in 2011.
Okay, so like midway through this. And CFAM is working with the General Assembly, with the WHO, with what agendas, what organizations of the United Nations is CFAM mainly working with?
So we follow all major UN processes that involve human rights and social policy. That includes the General Assembly, which adopts around 350 resolutions every year, of which I would say about 30 to 40 involve concerns for us in which we are directly involved.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, we also monitor the functional commissions of the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC for short, which are the Commission for Social Development, which just concluded this week in New York, at UN headquarters in New York, the Commission on the Status of Women next month, the Commission on Population and Development, as well as other smaller conferences and processes, including the interagency, different interagency working groups. We also monitor the Human Rights Council and all the human rights mechanisms in Geneva, including special procedures and the treaty bodies.
Okay. And so you said before that before, when the Catholics became involved in the work of the United Nations and its agendas, the decisions have all been made and the damage has already been done. So I understand that your placement in the United Nations right now allows you to monitor the planning that that is going on for the agenda. And so could you tell us a little bit about how you find yourself and how your organization finds itself in that hostile environment of the United Nations, the WHO, hostile to the pro-life issues, and how do you influence what is being done there?
Well, there are many different ways. So the primary way which we try to influence the debate is by direct contact with the diplomats, by informing them of what's actually going on in negotiations. Many of these diplomats have never understood UN policy, have never come across UN policy. They may come from bilateral settings where they have to deal one country with another country, and then they come here to the United Nations and there's negotiations over technical language in UN resolutions. What is the meaning of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, for example, or sexual and reproductive health, or preventing unsafe abortion? There's all sorts of terminologies that are debated in UN resolutions, and we try to help them by shedding light on their meaning. We provide them research on how they're used in UN reports, in the UN policies at the programmatic level, as well as by different international aid agencies like USAID, the German, the UK foreign aid agencies. And we show them how UN resolutions essentially are implemented by international donors, as including abortion, LGBT issues, anti-family policies. And so that's the primary way in which we influence the debate here at the United Nations. We also have direct involvement. We make statements whenever we're provided an opportunity to participate in a debate. And that's in some occasions that does spark some hostility to our position, including audible sighs and eyes rolling and all that kind of thing. And yeah, we also do research that is published widely, as well as our reports that happen every week. We report through the Friday Fax. It actually has a very interesting story. It actually used to be a Friday Fax. If you remember fax machines,
yes,
they were very popular in the 1990s. And my boss, Austin Ruse, used to send the Friday Fax from a fax machine to a list of numbers of the people who wanted to be appraised of what was happening at the United Nations. And that's how it took the name, the Friday Fax. It became eventually more of a journalistic kind of newsletter. So we do everything we can to abide to journalistic standards. And so we report accurately and objectively on the information that we receive from the delegates, even though many times they have to remain anonymous, of course, because of their intergovernmental debates that they tell us about. And so, yeah, so the Friday Facts is actually probably the most important thing CFEM does in terms of outreach, because I believe we're still in a phase of our work in terms of the pro-life cause internationally, as well as the pro-family cause internationally. We're still at a phase where we have to raise awareness. And this is not just with regards to politicians and diplomats, but also the wider public. We need to raise more awareness in order for there to be political accountability on the issues here at the UN. You know, I would, for example, tell you that, you know, Poland hasn't actually done much for the pro-life and pro-family cause at the United Nations, but most people in Poland don't know that. Most people in Poland are quite happy with what their government is doing at home on the pro-life and pro-family issue, for the most part, my understanding is, but they don't know, they aren't aware of the gap in what needs to be done internationally to promote the pro-life, pro-family cause.
Okay, so just to sum up, the battle that you're conducting are the battle on the fronts of protection of freedom of conscience, religious freedom, and pro-life causes and pro-family causes. Where does the hostility come from? Because it seems that everybody wants to, help these causes. Where is the hostility coming from? What directions?
Well, there's a lot of hostility to religious freedom, especially the freedom of conscience, and it's coming from the European Union for the most part. It's quite remarkable in that, you know, the European Union was founded as a bulwark against the Soviet Union in many ways, and in actual fact, it is transmorphing into a new Soviet Union kind of mechanism to coerce compliance with the diktats of a small bureaucratic oligarchy that runs the continent. And we are seeing more and more of that in UN policy, you know, and this is very interesting. Already in the 1990s, Marianne Glendon of Harvard, who was involved in these UN negotiations together with the Holy See, she complained of the positions the European Union was taking in a really great article in First Things. What really happened at Beijing? That was the title of the article.
Mm-hmm.
And she complained of how the European Union countries were essentially preventing any positive language on motherhood from appearing in UN resolutions. And she wondered, she could not understand why is there a problem with mentioning motherhood in a positive way in UN policy? And we are seeing exactly that same kind of position today, almost 30 years later. That is still the position of the European Union, that you cannot mention motherhood in a positive way in any UN resolution. And the reason they say in UN negotiations is that, we don't want to stereotype women as mothers, which is completely specious and pretextual. But that's the kind of negotiating position that we see recently at the Commission for Social Development. You know, EU diplomats from the European Union, I'm not even going to say who it is, but they know who they are. We're talking about how it's the state that has the primary responsibility for protecting the rights of children and for their well-being and protection. And to me, that is absurd. That sounds like something out of the Soviet Union. That's something that sounds like the children belong to the state. They don't belong to the families. And that is effectively the position that the European Union takes in UN negotiations currently. And in fact, we pointed out to them that the Convention on the Rights of the Child actually assigns the primary responsibility for the well-being of children to families, and the state only has the primary responsibility in cases where there's abuse, neglect, abandonment, that kind of thing. But so the most hostility we really see to the life and family, including conscience, is from the European Union, also from the United States during democratic administrations in particular. Although there's an overall anti-life, anti-family ethos in U.S. foreign assistance, because U.S. foreign assistance for a long time was invested in reducing populations around the world as a security concern. So, but with regard to the positions the EU takes, it really is remarkable. Every time I am surprised more and more by the positions they take.
Stefano, very interesting insights. Do you think that European policy, especially at UN level, has been hijacked by some of the most progressive countries like Netherlands, UK, France, Germany, and not to say Scandinavians? How what's the distribution of force? Why is it so? Because many European countries are Christian nations, and to have such radical position at UN means that some groups have been dominating this narrative.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think it's a combination of many factors, but I think the biggest one is that most of the countries that you would say are conservative at a social level tend to not be invested politically in the international system and international social policy debates in particular. I mean, I don't think many people in Eastern Europe and in Slovakia or Croatia or Bosnia-Herzegovina are in any way interested in what happens in the United Nations, because they're too worried about what happens at home. They're trying to promote economic development at home. They're trying to provide for their families. They're worried already about domestic policies and politics. Worrying about international politics is just sounds very, very difficult. Moreover, international mechanisms are very complex, just from the point of view of the law, the legal and the technical administrative matters of how UN processes take place. It's very hard for political parties themselves to even engage. And therefore, in every government, you have a certain level of diplomatic experts within the governments that take care of all these international mechanisms, and they don't really have any effective oversight. So this is what takes place in more sophisticated countries that have traditions of self-governance, and as well as institutions that function fairly well, including most countries in Eastern Europe. But then you have what happens in countries in Africa, Latin America, most of Asia, where they're simply not even aware of what's going on at the United Nations. Most people in these poorer countries, less developed countries, they're simply looking to the United Nations for a handout, for help, for UN agencies to come in and provide programming for education or for maternal health or for something. And they don't really see the United Nations as a global governance mechanism at all. And I think that's a mistake. I think people should be more aware of the real influence that UN mechanisms have over domestic policies, far-reaching influence, even in developed countries that, generally speaking, developed countries think, we're going to tell the UN what to promote, and they're not going to affect the way we govern ourselves, internally. But in actual fact, UN policies have more and more reach within domestic systems. Just think about the gender issue. The gender issue has exploded in the last 10 years, but the gender issue was dormant in UN policy for 30 years. In 1995 at the Beijing conference, when the United Nations first started using the term gender very controversially, everybody thought, it just talks about women. It doesn't mean that, men and women can define themselves and decide for themselves what gender to be. Well, lo and behold, that entire agenda in many ways has been supported through these international mechanisms. It has developed ideologically, and the international system is basically there waiting for openings in domestic politics to promote their agenda. So much so that you now have a UN agency called UN Women, which in many ways is the culmination of the Beijing agenda. And UN Women is an organization. It's a huge UN agency which has almost $1 billion budget every year, and it has an incredible reach. It has offices in every country in the world, or every region in the world, but it has a reach in every country in the world, and their entire focus is lobbying for transformative gender norms, as they call it. If you understand, a lot of what they're going to do promote is actually good things, ending child marriage, against female genital mutilation, ensuring that all girls have a chance to get an education. These are all positive things that everybody agrees with, that are part of the women's agenda that all countries agree to. But they also are promoting much more than that, than these positive norms that everybody agrees on. They are also promoting radical notions of gender as a social construct, and including the full panoply of the LGBT agenda for children, sexual autonomy for children, and so it's this UN agency, UN Women, is entirely dedicated to that. They don't have any real programming in countries. They're not in the business of bringing food, medicines, education, or they are in the business of training activists and politicians on modern Western feminism. That's their sole mission. So you essentially have this agenda that is dormant for in many countries, but as soon as there's a political opening, the agencies push it through together with their partners. It's not just the UN agencies. They also work with philanthropists, philanthropic organizations, as well as NGOs funded by foreign governments that are on board with the same agenda, as well as other international organizations.
That's a very important motive, what you mentioned, because sometimes this idea come with money. And if you could elaborate a little bit more about this evolution of UN, when earlier, especially at the beginning, when you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and then this natural set of human rights, which was then expanded, suddenly you see a lot of sponsors and NGOs which play a role of lobbying groups. And could you elaborate what is the mechanics of this kind of lobbying, which is fueled by probably substantial amount of money? You mentioned some organizations, government organization, European Union, probably also US government. How it works in terms of the funding?
Well, you guys in Poland know very well, because you guys have always been historically one of the places where the culture wars between the Soviet Union and the United States played out. You've always had cultural organizations supported by the United States and cultural organizations supported by the Soviet Union, and you have a clash of ideas. And you see that in every field, whether it's social, economic, political, human rights. The human rights fora are just one more place where these debates go on. But historically, these debates were always about what are real human rights. And the United States insisted that real human rights are civil and political rights, and the Soviet Union insisted that real rights are economic and social rights. And in the human rights system at the international level, these two currents sort of were melded together in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the binding international treaties that have been promulgated by the General Assembly. But that, you could say, that's like that was like you had the first generation of human rights with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then you have the second generation of human rights, which is the binding international treaties. And now you have a third generation of rights, which are the rights that are being developed through the human rights mechanisms under the external pressures of powerful countries, as well as donors like Soros Foundation, for example, who are paying for specific agendas to be promoted through the United Nations. So, for example, in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the UN Human Rights Office, which runs every program involving human rights at the United Nations, they receive money from Nordic countries to promote LGBT rights. And they have been doing so for more than a decade. And they run campaigns. They make sure that every UN report has an LGBT focus. There are focal points in every UN agency that cooperate with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on promoting LGBT rights. Until 2019, they reported on those focal points. There was a human rights report which listed all the activities of the United Nations on LGBT issues, and they do so, within the international system, and then they also do it domestically. They also fund NGOs to promote these issues through the judiciary, through the legislative branch, at the cultural level. One of the most even now the U.S. foreign assistance is promoting, for example, the LGBT agenda through every possible program they can, and whether it's climate change, whether it's democracy, whether it's women's issues, it all comes back down to LGBT issues. It really is a remarkable thing that how in the last 10 to 15 years this agenda has emerged and engulfed the UN system.
Is it the result of the evolution of society that the society became very much open and promoting these gender ideas, this gender as a social construct, LGBT, and probably gender change, gender dysphoria kind of situation? Is it because of society? Is it because of the elite which are pushing this agenda? What is the factor which has decisive impact on this kind of departure from the original human rights envisioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Could you tell us why this journey ended up in such a dramatic direction? Because probably the founders of UN didn't even imagine that this kind of right, like right to abortion, can be accepted as a human right.
No, absolutely. In fact, if you look at the debates around the major UN human rights treaties, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they explicitly rejected a right to abortion in the negotiations and on multiple occasions, including the most recent negotiations of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006. A right to abortion was rejected. So if you go in the notes of the conference where the treaty was adopted, you will find this rejection. But it's how did we get here? That's a huge question. There's raging debates about this. There's debates that somehow this the woke, if you like, we can call it the woke agenda. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with this. The woke agenda is somehow the natural outgrowth of the liberal tradition of self-government that the United States inaugurated somehow. That somehow we, there's some, scholars who maintain this position that somehow this was the inevitable fruit of the ideological founding of the United States and the modern world order. On the other hand, there are those that say no, that the political system and doesn't necessarily need to lead to that conclusion, I find myself somewhere in between. I certainly believe that there are ideological elements that are inherently in favor of autonomy as the highest norm in society, and therefore sexual autonomy and self-definition, if indeed individual autonomy is the highest good for society, then probably you will lead even the context of sexual autonomy. What can you say then? There's no limit to sexual autonomy. You can't put any limits on sexual autonomy because you can't put any limits on personal freedom. And there is that ideological element, but I also think that a lot more responsibility comes down to the people in government who have a chance to do something and decide not to do anything. I think there's a lot of personal responsibility for where we are now. I don't want to accept a deterministic vision of history at all. I also want to keep in mind the Herculean efforts of John Paul the Great and even his predecessor Paul VI to fight this war against this ethic of sexual autonomy as the highest good. And I don't think that their calls to conversion, they're calling the culture of Europe to conversion, Europeans to conversion, the world ultimately to responsibility. I don't think their moral calls were void. If we accept the deterministic vision of history that we were inevitably led to this moment, this woke moment, then the efforts of these great men were ultimately in vain and couldn't do much. But I do think there's a lot of personal responsibility of people who could have done something, and they instead simply went with the flow. They went with the general flow of the institutions, of the culture, even if it was under the influence of these liberal biases.
But do you think that the changes are being done sort of in the way of thinking? That are they being done bottoms up, or is there a concert of international, supranational organizations that are pushing towards a direction? Because it seems to me that there's so much money involved in that, and there's powerful organizations promoting certain things, that it doesn't seem that it's a reflection of the change of mentality of individuals. And then you said, on the one hand, we are talking about increasing individual autonomy in various areas, but on the other hand, we see an increasing power of international and supranational organizations that are leaning towards something. What are the lines of progression? What is the lines of thrust that these organizations are moving towards?
So wow, a lot of question with regards to the overall direction we're going is the elevation of personal autonomy, and in particular sexual autonomy, as the highest norm for international institutions. It is remarkable. It's simply to the point of in the context, for example, of debates about surrogacy internationally, you have UN agencies now who are talking about in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, as rights, individual rights, that individuals, including homosexual couples, have a right to this as part of their sexual and reproductive health. Why is this? I mean, how is this possible? It's because the notion is that essentially you can create yourself, and sexuality and human life are so intertwined that you have to go to sexuality. You have to reform the way human beings think about sexuality in order to transform societies. With regards to whether it's a top-down, bottoms-up, it's both. It's both. I mean, so there are cultural forces that once they take root, they take on a life of their own. We are, as René Girard liked to say, mimetic animals. if you start a trend, more and more people will flow to that trend. And so the fact that culture has been, without a doubt, the liberal progressive forces have invested a lot in media, in narratives, in stories, in movies, in culture, and publications. And that has had a huge effect on the culture. But there's also there's influence from norm making, from policymakers, from judicial decisions, including Roe v. Wade or Obergefell. There's both forces. I'll give you the example. For example, here in the United States, prior to the Obergefell decision, which made homosexual marriage essentially a constitutional right under the United States Constitution, until then, I think it was something like 32 states had voted against homosexual marriage. And in the 1990s, the Congress almost unanimously passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which prohibited the recognition of homosexual marriage for the purpose of federal social protection. So we went from, without a doubt, there was a transition in the culture, which was motivated by media, by cultural forces, but it still hadn't been able, by the year 2008, when there was Proposition 8 in California, when the state of California, one of the most liberal states in the United States, voted against homosexual marriage. There was still a majority of people, even Barack Obama, when he ran for president, he was not in favor of homosexual marriage. He couldn't declare himself in favor of homosexual marriage. And yet by the year 2012, he was in favor of it. And a couple of years later, we had the Obergefell decision, in which the Supreme Court declared a right to homosexual marriage. And now nobody's willing to challenge that. Nobody is willing to challenge homosexual marriage in the United States politically. It's remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable.
Do you think that this kind of coordination between the UN and its agencies, because we are talking about also WHO and UNICEF and some other coordination between big sponsors? I just recall when President Trump blocked funding of UN, suddenly big sponsors like Gates, Soros, I think also Warren Buffett and others started to finance UN, even if there were clear calls for reform, because this is a very bureaucratic organization. There are a lot of unanswered questions regarding corruption, regarding the efficiency of this organization. And then with the new administration, the flow of funding from US government started again. We see combination of a lot of money coming to UN and spent on causes which are quite controversial. Is there any opposition in the UN against such undermining of natural law, undermining marriage and family?
There are many delegations who are against this and speak out against it, including in the most recent General Assembly. We had 62 countries vote against language, controversial, ambiguous language that includes LGBT issues. So the phrase specifically, multiple intersecting forms of discrimination. The idea of intersectionality was mostly just an academic idea for 20 years. The idea that you have intersecting discriminations that oppress people, essentially the woke agenda, was mostly an academic idea. But over the last, 5 to 10 years, it's been politicized. It's becoming a political agenda. And including in UN policy with this terminology that recognizes multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. And essentially, that's a notion that is being streamlined in every UN policy, so that every UN policy eventually can be reduced to how you identify yourself, whether you're gay, bisexual, homosexual, transgender, etc., as well as your race, your ethnicity, or and other intersecting factors of discrimination. So this, we had about 62 countries vote against this language on multiple intersecting forms of discrimination, even though even more are against the notion of LGBT rights. But it's very difficult for traditional countries to block anything anymore. They can block only explicit references to LGBT issues, to abortion rights. They can block explicit references. Why? Because of the political accountability. Because if there is, if you went back home and it was shown that you supported explicitly language on abortion or LGBT issues, you would have political problems. But most countries, even traditional countries, will not oppose ambiguous language that the UN system uses to promote LGBT issues and abortion, including terms like sexual and reproductive health, multiple intersecting forms of discrimination. There's simply too many countries are beholden to the European Union and the United States. So many countries receive assistance, from the European Union, and they don't want to jeopardize that, because they look at the UN as more than anything as a source of international assistance. They don't see the United Nations as a global mechanism for governance. And therefore, they don't realize how this money, how these programs how these norms are then going to affect them and harm them. And so, with regards, there's not enough countries that are willing to block the agenda that is coming then implemented through the agencies and the partners. With regards to UN reform, how can you change this? Well, I mean, the only way to change it is if you have both the United States and the European Union on the same page, and they're against this. And that's not happening. I don't see that happening until countries like Poland, Hungary, and others in Eastern Europe actually decide to change the direction of the European Union on human rights and social policy. Because right now the European Union is the most stable partner internationally for developing countries. So they don't want to upset the European Union, because the European Union is a very reliable partner providing foreign assistance. Collectively, the European Union provides even more foreign assistance than the United States, development assistance, that is. Therefore, for many countries, it's simply not a possibility for them to speak against the European Union, or they're always going to try find a way to please the European Union, to find that ambiguous compromise to allow, the European Union to do what it wants with its money. And so the only way for that to change is for both the US and the EU to have a pro-life, pro-family foreign policy. Now, I don't think that's impossible. I think we're a lot closer now to that reality than ever we were, at least at a political level. But I think it takes people becoming responsible and deciding to impact the debate in Brussels in ways that they're not willing now.
Very interesting. Your insights bring the question, what are the mechanisms operating inside these committees? You attend the meetings, sometimes quite manipulative. You mentioned in your last mailing that that you learned that in the back rooms of the United States, powerful countries lie to smaller countries, claiming that these resolutions, which are very progressive, are without any impact without any legal effect. So encouraging smaller countries, poorer countries to vote, but then these non-binding resolutions through this so-called mechanism of customary international law become, in a way, law. Could you clarify this manipulative mechanism, which sounds very strange but happening?
It's one of the darndest things, I have to say. I mean, it's really amazing. When I came to the United Nations initially, I was at a loss as to what to do with UN policy. And that is the same position that anybody who first becomes acquainted with the United Nations experiences. You do not understand what UN policy is, because legally you're told, well, this is not binding on states. Well, if it's not binding on states, then why do we even care what goes into these documents? Why do you even care? And that's how a lot of this bad language gets into these UN documents, because of this technical legal lens through which these documents were viewed. In actual fact, UN resolutions are binding. They are binding. Anybody who says that UN resolutions are not binding is either lying or has not understood the process. UN resolutions are binding, even if they are not binding on states. They are binding on the UN system. So they are legal documents which have binding value. They are also a record of the positions of states in an international fora, which that means that, so first of all, they are binding on the UN system. Therefore, they have programmatic implications with regards what the UN system may or may not do within your country and within other countries. Then there's also the question of the legal implications for countries of these UN resolutions, because while they may not be binding in and of themselves, because of the action of UN agencies to implement them programmatically and the continued endorsement of states of these resolutions, then they can become binding over time under the theory of customary international law, which posits that basically governments have the actions of governments in international fora can constitute evidence that a customary international norm is arising. So I'll give you a concrete example, because this is all very abstract and difficult to follow. The concrete example is language on sexual and reproductive health. It has been in these UN resolutions for over 20 years now, coming close on 30 years. And it has been consistently implemented by UN rights mechanisms, by UN agencies and UN programs in their publications, in their internal manuals, as including abortion as a human right. And the UN General Assembly has continued to adopt this language on sexual and reproductive health, and has continued to mandate the same activities that the UN system has gone on implementing. The implication of this continued action by UN agencies, in light of the mandates they received from the UN system, is that a customary international norm is emerging. This is what, groups like International Planned Parenthood have already claimed in US courts. And they are claiming internationally in foreign courts. In Colombia, for example, the Supreme Court of Colombia legalized abortion in that country, even though the legislature in Colombia has not spoken about abortion, and every attempt to liberalize abortion laws there has failed. The Constitutional Court has said that there's an international right to abortion, and the executive has simply implemented the Constitutional Court's opinions in blatant disregard of what happened in the legislature. This kind of constitutional crisis is going to be more and more the norm. Even aside from the sexual and reproductive health and abortion issue, okay? So I've explained how customary international law works. This constitutional crisis, where you have a conflict between what the international experts are trying to implement through a judicial system or through an executive branch compared to the legislative branch, this constitutional crisis is what the globalists, if you want to try to group the people who believe in the international system together, this is kind of constitutional crisis is what they want to cause everywhere in every country in the world in order to implement their priorities, their goals. And so it's a real problem, customary international law, and it's not just limited to the abortion and life issues. They're also involved in all the topics covered by UN resolutions.
And so it seems that there's a lot of cooperation to introduce a certain way of operation on the international level. Where do you think this is leading to? What are the end games of this initiative? You mentioned very briefly that at some point the United States were supporting certain objectives because of national security reasons. Now, is this all leading to depopulation? Are there other objectives of all these initiatives?
The end game was very succinctly put by Klaus Schwab. You will own nothing and you will be happy. This
to make us happy, isn't it?
Yes. No, I'm very Augustinian in my worldview. I mean, I see that nobody does, evil out of a desire to do evil. Everybody does evil because out of a desire to do good, and I think that means everyone. But there are different levels of responsibility. There are, without a doubt, the ideologues, the people who go to Davos, and the people who are leaders of this ideological agenda. And then there are all the others, underlings, who are simply vying for power and position, and they're simply doing what they think is necessary to advance themselves within the framework, the power structure. And so, I think that's where the personal responsibility is. A lot of people would rather go along with the prevailing current rather than take responsibility and do what is right. And I think that's the major problem that we have. And I think there's more and more a moral hazard that exists in the global governance model. And look at, for example, what happened during the COVID pandemic, where essentially you had the World Health Organization dictating to the world their domestic health policies. And domestic experts, domestic politicians, would rather abdicate their responsibility completely than get it wrong. Because if you get it wrong, there's political repercussions. So there's a moral hazard where the politicians will say, well, we're just going to do what the international experts say. We're doing what the international experts say. We're going to do what they say. And so that way they can absolve themselves of any political responsibility. And I think this moral hazard in the global governance model is undermining democracy in many other ways, not just during the COVID pandemic. It's happening with climate change. It's happening with many other issues, including the gender issue. When you talk about gender, everybody says, oh yeah, this is women. Are you against women? You must be a misogynist if you don't agree with gender policies. If you don't want to go along with the Istanbul Convention. And it's not true. It's simply, this is sort of like, here in the United States, we call it, moral grandstanding or gaslighting. You're trying to essentially silence anybody who has any objection. But it's that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a moral hazard, which is that you no longer have self-governance because domestic politician and others would rather abdicate their responsibility to international bodies rather than face the consequences politically.
So you mentioned Karl Schwab, and I was thinking that you working in the United Nations, you are sitting at the top of the world, you have a complete view of everything that is going on, but then it turns out that the scenarios for the UN may be written somewhere else. What is the relationship? Do you see a relationship between the World Economic Forum and the UN?
I think the connections are not so much formal. There are certain many informal connections in the sense that you're talking about the countries, the ministries that already have constant contact. I mean, like, for example, there's something like 150 WHO workers who are at the same time part of this Center for Disease Control and Prevention here in the United States. I mean, they're like working together. And National Institute for Health. There's simply a complete intertwining of the bureaucracies. Even in Europe, there's no European country. You can go and talk to your ministers, and they simply can't move. They can't do anything without consulting their counterparts in other capitals in Europe. And it's simply remarkable how intertwined the different bureaucracies of all these developed countries have become. And then you look at developing countries, and it's the same thing. There's a Ministry of Health, there's a Ministry of Gender, and who do you think gets to pick the ministers? There certainly is a political position, But if they want to continue to receive funding from Western governments, they have to align with the agenda. So I do think that there are no, maybe the Davos Forum itself does not have a formal. It's more of a think tank conference, but it's sort of, the Davos Forum sort of celebrates the already existing bureaucratic ties between our countries, the leading media and corporate entities as well. More and more corporate structures are becoming intertwined with governance structures. Forget about regulatory capture. We're talking about complete synergy.
So you mentioned that one of the goals is the economic goal, that we will have nothing and we will be happy. Then you mentioned briefly that the changes that are being introduced are undermining democracies and sort of center of powers. We here in Europe see that the major center of power is the European Commission, which is unelected. And you mentioned that the WHO has been running the world for 2 years and the WHO is, again, unelected. Is this a global trend? Are we moving away from democratic representative forms of government into government by entities that are elected or selected in a very unclear and transparent way and have unlimited power and no responsibility?
And no accountability. They are not accountable to anyone, right?
Yeah, we're talking about the global administrative state here. If you like, if you want to talk in a way, yes, in a sense, it's totally undermining democracy. I mean, formally, this global governance structure does not have these legal powers. Let me be clear, right? We are talking about, but in a piecemeal way, we are seeing more and more an undermining of national, domestic, and domestic political processes. I mean, even in, for example, we have the in the United States, for example, the gender policies that are now being promulgated throughout the federal government, they cite UN policy as the source for the ideology. So it's remarkable. They're simply there waiting for a favorable political environment to make their agenda binding. And they will push at every possible button. And it is a formidable machine, even diplomatically. In fact, there was one of the most interesting debates that happens every 2 years at the United Nations is the debate on the death penalty. Because the European Union, of course, is in favor of the abolition of the death penalty. And they pressure capitals all around the world on this topic in order to adopt a resolution that does not refer back to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which expressly reserves the death penalty in cases of very serious crimes and where it's not possible to otherwise. There's a caveat. Generally international law is not pro death penalty. But it does recognize the need for the death penalty in certain cases, or for the discretion of governments to allow the death penalty in those cases. And the European Union is very much pushing against the death penalty internationally. But for some reason, it's one of those few resolutions where most developing countries are able to gather together to speak out against the European Union. And it's been on several occasions that diplomats have complained about how the powerful diplomatic machine of the European Union has agitated around the world on this single issue. But it's not just this single issue. We see it in every issue. The European Union has a machine that is remarkable, because we're not just talking about the experts in Brussels. We're talking about their counterparts in every capital in Europe and their embassies, their ministries all around the world. So we are talking about a really formidable machine for global governance. The other interesting thing is that the European Union is exporting this model governance by executive bureaucratic fiat to Africa and other regions, including through regional and sub-regional agreements. And so it's fascinating. It really is a remarkable moment we live in, and there are people here in the United States who already question whether, you know, we're already staring at the end of self-government.
Stefano, tell me please, this mechanism of impacting poor countries, sort of blackmailing. If you don't accept certain policies, you won't get funding. It has been happening for years with USAID, but I understand the same mechanism is applied by European Union donors. So how this might impact the balance of power in the UN General Assembly and in terms of major political shifts at WHO or in all these in major agencies of UN, this blackmailing, and then we've got this mechanism of monitoring or screening the implementation of particular resolution. This put enormous pressure on the local governments. And from the perspective of the just citizen of Poland, this is the second question: what we can do, because this is a bit blurred. This is somewhere in the sky. People don't care about such things. What's happening in UN, but it has impact on their daily life sooner or later. So if you could explain this blackmailing mechanism, and then what we can do.
Well, it's not so much blackmailing as perhaps buying out, if you like.
Okay.
And I think you could,
more diplomatically put.
Yeah, I think you can no, there are absolutely instances of blackmail, including instances where we know that there's been blackmail. But that's the exception. The more common practices is simply buying out. So, for example, if you look at all USAID contracts going out now, they always have an LGBT component. If you look at the same with the foreign aid that's coming from the European Union, the same thing. There's always going to be an LGBT component, and or sexual and reproductive health or other controversial issues, and therefore it's not so much a question. And you know very well how the mechanism works in Poland. In a sense, you've become part of the European Union now. And so the economic ties, the economic programs, the economic aid that you receive has somehow tied you to this behemoth. And you never know how much you can say or not say, how much you can dissent or not from what the European Union is doing as a whole, because you're afraid that you're going to lose the financial assistance or somehow hamper those ties, economic ties that you have with the rest of the continent. And it's implicit in the and the voters understand this clearly too. It's just whether we want to be, I guess the choice is, do you want to be financially secure and part of the EU bloc, or endure a little bit more uncertainty, but preserve your self-government and your independence? That's the choice that every country is facing everywhere. Mm-hmm. That's the choice that the diplomats face personally. Do I want to take more personal responsibility and flag these controversial issues to my foreign ministry, even though it may jeopardize my career, even though it may mean that I may never work for a UN agency, because the Secretariat of the United Nations has my number? That's the choice everybody has to make.
And so, if we are speaking about the performance of individual politicians and individual societies, maybe you could say a couple of things about what countries like Poland or Hungary, that are considered to be conservative and pro-life, pro-family, what is actually their actual position in the United Nations? How do we score against that reputation? And if you may sort of compare and contrast in a certain way, I know that among the Western Europeans, Russia is enjoying a reputation of a conservative country. What are their positions and their opinions regarding those pro-life, pro-family issues?
Well, Poland and Hungary simply don't exist at the United Nations. There only exists the European Union. And I say this dramatically because it's becoming more and more the truth. Essentially, every European country has abdicated their ability to participate in negotiations internationally, independently of the European Union. And we see this more and more. In the end, they will. In the end, you could argue that that is such an essential attribute of sovereignty that you're abdicating sovereignty itself. The fact that you don't have your own independent voice in international fora is a very grave thing indeed. I encourage EU people working in the ministry, in their ministries, that I've met to speak out independently of the EU every time they get, because you will disappear. You will become a non-entity, a non-sovereign entity in the long run, if the only thing that matters is what the EU decides to say, or even if you're negotiating within the EU, the positions of the EU, still, if Poland and Hungary aren't visible internationally as sovereign actors, also from a legal standpoint, you could argue they are going to disappear. And right now, de facto, they don't exist in some ways. So I do, this is not to say that the diplomats aren't doing their job, but I'm just saying that from the point of view of somebody looking externally, objectively at what's going on in a UN negotiation or the adoption of a UN resolution, the European Union exists, but the member states don't exist as sovereign entities. So I simply always strongly advise, anybody from Europe to insist on having your own voice in affairs, integrating EU foreign policy on issues that are not EU competencies, including all these social issues, should simply not happen. So simply not have happened, but it has happened. So I would say, it could start with blocking every agreement from the EU Council of Ministers, not allowing the EU Council of Ministers to agree on external action priorities on other than having to do with EU competencies, and strictly understood. And I do think that there is we're still in a world where countries like Poland, Hungary, can retain their sovereignty, so to speak. But unless they do something to break EU foreign policy, I don't see that happening in the long run. Also, keep in mind, as once again I said, this international system, like the European Union, is simply waiting there, pressuring every ministry in Poland, every ministry in Hungary, waiting for there to be a favorable political climate to push their agenda through. All it will take is for the government to change, and they will flood the country with everything. All of the things that you've been fighting domestically, they will come from the outside, because you haven't been fighting them on the outside. You've only been fighting them on the inside. And I think that's the threat that many politicians don't understand. It is existential. It is an existential threat. Unless you fight these harmful foreign policies at the UN, in Brussels, they will come flooding back in as soon as there's a change of government, which is politically feasible. It's not. I'm not talking about something that will happen in 20 years. It could happen in 4 years, right? It's not. It's not something impossible. So that's what I think is lacking. I mean, Poland and Hungary could do a lot at the United Nations. It's just not happening. We're not seeing a coordinated response. They could do things also in domestic laws. For example, adopting laws that prohibit the use of Polish foreign assistance, because Poland is an international donor now, a net donor, didn't you know? Also Hungary, prohibiting the use of any international assistance from Poland for promoting abortion or funding abortion groups. Even better, funding abortion groups, sort of like a Mexico City policy, adopting a Mexico City policy domestically, which if effectively would have an impact on the European Union itself, right? This kind of thing has to happen, including other, I mean, I'm talking about just a Mexico City policy style law having to do with abortion, but there are many issues on which this kind of thinking has to take place, not just the pro-life, pro-family issue. And that's in order for Poland and Hungary to be able to retain their ability to speak as sovereign states in international fora. We have seen one issue on which Hungary in particular, but also other members of the European Union, has been able to coalesce and challenge the European Union, is that is migration. We have seen an example. So we know there is a formula to do it. We know that there is a way to beat the EU at its own game. Why are we not doing it on the life and family issues and other issues? That's a question for you guys to ask domestically.
Stefano, just from point of view of just a simple lay person who just wonder what I can do to change those kind of situation where someone at the UN level kind of pressured by US and European Union is changing the fundamental policies regarding the, for example, human rights. What we can do as laypersons, as citizens. Any idea how you talk to people from Africa, how they can be impactful on those? And the second question, we already discussed that the sustainable development goals. I would like you to reflect upon, because there are certain pills, bad pills in this basket. How this happened that Holy See signed that Agenda 2030, whose part of is sustainable development goals.
So with regards to what can citizens do, it depends what your government allows citizens to do. In every country, there's a way for citizens to have an impact, whether it is through civil society organizations, whether it's through direct contact with their representatives in Congress. I do think congressional action is always very important. So speaking through the legislature, whether it's a resolution, whether it's a law, just demand accountability. And I think it's very important. I think we're still at a stage where there's just isn't awareness. So if you are a citizen and wondering what you can do, is raise more awareness among citizens about this issue. I think the most important thing is not to pander to power. There's a temptation in politics, which is to compromise principle for power. So when a party that is favorable, or has been at least in their promises favorable to you, reaches power, well, then you sort of try not to be too critical because you don't want to upset them, right? This is the biggest danger. No. When your politicians are in power, when the government that represents you is in power, that is when you have to be more aggressive and make more demands. Because when they're gone, you have nothing. While they're there, you can obtain your priorities. But when they're gone, you have nothing, and you have no chance of getting anything done. So I think it very important is not to pander to power, not to make compromises with power, especially for civil society organizations. Politicians will respect you a lot more if you are independent, if you do not kowtow to power. Politicians will respect you a lot more if they know that you have an independent position and that you will hold them accountable for their failures. So never compromise principles with power. I think that's the most important thing for everyone. And also at a personal level, I think there's something very true about what Pope Francis talks about, a global culture of indifference. I don't think we see this more than anywhere than with the context of children in the womb. You know, we're talking about millions and millions of children being killed in their womb, millions of women who will bear the scars from that every day for the rest of their lives. And it's all happening because of lies. It's all happening because of lies, because of deception. And we citizens simply can't stand for it. We have to be, we have to speak out. We have to say something about it. We have to break off from this indifference, even if it means standing out in a room where nobody wants to hear your voice and saying something that nobody wants to hear. That's so important. And in a sense, it requires a personal conversion of us, if you like, even to take these unpopular positions. You know, I face it at the United Nations myself. You know, to speak and say something in a room where nobody wants to hear it, you know, it's not easy. It's a lot easier to just go along and not say anything. And yet that's somehow the conversion that's also required of us, to be a voice for those who can't speak for themselves.
And maybe to help that conversion a little bit, you know, you are talking about a number of trends in the international law, a number of phenomena that are starting to be called human rights, like sexual and reproductive health and rights. So abortion becomes a human right, and other things like that. Where does that, if these notions become the law, where does that put us as Christians? And what situations are we going to find ourselves? We already see people arrested in Britain for thought prayer. We see an attempt to put right to abortion into constitution in France. This push is going on, you know, at full speed throughout the world. What position are we going to find ourselves as Christians once these trends become law?
Well, it's very clear where we're going. I mean, in California, they adopted a law that essentially takes away children's custody from parents who don't allow them to transition to a different gender. So if a parent objects to their 13-year-old child having gender affirming treatment, or that is taking hormones that will stop their pubertal development, so that they can then transition eventually to being of the opposite sex, parents will lose custody of their children. This is in California. We're not talking about Mars. And I think more and more U.S. states will adopt those policies. I'm hoping that Europe will take a different direction, given the scandals that have taken place with the Tavistock clinic. The impression that I have is that some European governments are taking a more nuanced position on this, but I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that they can withstand the momentum that the transgender cause has, and I don't think that they can decouple the transgender from the homosexual side of the agenda. I think the two are too intertwined. I think they're too important to each other in the long run. But with regards to where this agenda is going, it's, you know, during the pandemic there were in Washington, D.C., there were crowds of people, there were bands of people that would go into restaurants and scream in the faces of politicians or people that they disagreed with. There's a lot of violence in society. You saw what happens with the Black Lives Matters movement, that it became very violent in certain U.S. cities. You saw mobs destroying the city centers of many U.S. cities. I'm afraid that violence can come out also in forms of persecution and eventually. I'm not talking about this is happening tomorrow, but it can happen quicker than you think, I think. I think we definitely have the danger, but there are definitely already, dangers to parents who want to homeschool, for example, all across Europe. There are dangers for nurses who object to participating in abortions or even transgender surgeries. There's a lot of already places where conscience is being trampled upon, even in UN documents. The UN rapporteur on freedom of conscience is already pronounced himself on the side of abortion and LGBT issues against conscience, that people cannot object to providing these services, if you like. The same goes with the UN agencies. The humanitarian manual for reproductive health that UN agencies collectively use says that the UN system should not partner with organizations in humanitarian settings that don't refer women for abortion. So if you have a Catholic doctor or a Catholic agency in Syria or Turkey right now who's providing assistance, the UN agencies would say, no, we're not going to partner with you. We're not going to help give you money. We're not going to provide you our blankets and our food because you don't refer women for abortions. This is where we're going. This is where they want to go. We know this also from what happened with the Obama administration with the contraception and abortion mandate. We can only, it's going to happen more. You saw it also in the context of the rule of law debate with the EU Commission in Poland and Hungary. This is where we're going. We're going towards coercion. And if you convince enough people that Christians are a threat, and that what Christians are teaching is a threat to society, things can change pretty quickly. So, we may yet get a chance to obtain the palm of victory.
Which palm are you talking about? Hopefully not the palm of martyrdom, or maybe hopefully so. Well, do you see a possibility or a chance of reversion of the U.S. foreign policy? Because we've noticed that when the administration changed the last time, there's been a decisive shift from withdrawing from support of abortion and birth control and things like that towards full speed support of that. One of the first decisions of the new administration was the withdrawal from the Geneva Consensus. Do you see a chance that the changes in the United States that are happening right now are going to dictate a shift away from this policy, so that there will be less pressure on third world countries, but also on European countries to adopt these policies?
That's very hard to say. I mean, the Biden administration is doing a lot of damage right now. With the State Department, it's going to take generations to undo. Even under the Trump administration, we were able to do very little within the State Department itself. There are some good pieces of policy in place that can help restart things if there is a pro-life administration in the future. But it's going to be an uphill struggle. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be a battle. It can be done, but you need the people who are willing to fight in the next administration, if it is pro-life, to willing to really take on a fight. And that even in the Trump administration, a lot of people weren't able to or willing to. So it's an uphill struggle. I just wanted to answer the question about the Holy See at the United Nations. The Holy See is the best friend of the unborn and the family at the United Nations, and they are often the only voice speaking for the unborn, for the family, and they have been for the last 30, 40 years. They are remarkable people who do really amazing work, enduring the scorn and the derision of EU diplomats, American diplomats, and from many others from around the world who really despise them and what the Holy See has to say. In negotiations as well as in the official meetings. So With regards to the Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals, sadly, the agenda contains language on reproductive health and
gender equality, and
the Holy See. The Holy See joined the agenda with a reservation. The reservation was that it does not understand sexual and reproductive health to refer to abortion, as well as that it understands gender as only referring to men and women, and things. It joined the agenda with reservations. You know, there was a debate, I think, back in probably in the 1990s when there were the UN conferences, where what shall we do? Shall we reject this agenda completely and not even engage? Or shall we be part of the debate and try to work from within to do as much as possible and simply make official declarations to distance ourselves from the controversial elements? You know, we're still operating under that framework where we are within and we are making reservations and objections. I say we, but I don't speak for the Holy See. The Holy See is a separate. We are an independent organization, although we support the Holy See fully in what they are trying to do. Yes. So there are questions about, you know, is there a danger of confusion, of creating moral confusion? I think there is, and that's why it's so important for the Holy See to keep speaking loudly on issues like abortion, the family, and they do. And, you know, even in, you know, like what Pope Francis said in Laudato Si on the issue of reproductive health, you know, it's so important to speak with a moral clarity on these issues, especially since the Holy See is now flying its flag at the United Nations. This is it's so important to speak loudly, and the Holy See does. And, you know, whenever a UN document, a resolution is adopted that includes language on reproductive health, the Holy See always makes a reservation, distancing itself from abortion or any interpretation that would include abortion. And I think that's fundamental. And I think that speaks to the role of the Holy See to be a moral beacon in these international fora, to make present a different understanding of human dignity, one that is informed by faith. Because in the end, this is what it all comes down to. It all comes down to, what is human dignity? What is human dignity that we should protect the unborn in the womb? How high is the human dignity that we have to protect human life even when it is a clump of cells in the womb? And ultimately, the answer that comes from faith is that human dignity comes from the incarnation, that God became man. He became one of us. He was one of us in the womb of Mary. You know, this is the tradition of the church. If you go to Nazareth or to the house of Loreto, in Loreto, it's there are the words in Latin above the altar, hic verbo factum est. This is where the word became flesh. And this is ultimately the understanding of human dignity that we have. It's also the understanding of human dignity that I've received from the church, from the announcement of the gospel. I come from the experience called the Neo-Catechumenal Way, which I don't know if you are familiar with, and the announcement of the gospel is the core of this. And in some ways, I like to think, I hope that somehow protecting human dignity internationally in these fora. I'm also in a small, perhaps very insignificant way, also announcing the good news, that is that God chose to become one of us to save us, and so you know, that's what motivates me on a personal level. It's to help people recognize the inherent dignity and beauty of life, and which ultimately was revealed on the cross. So.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. These are very good words.
Yeah, very encouraging and motivating. Probably we will need to call it a day. Really, it was very inspiring what you said. All these insights into operations of the United Nations and how to protect the human dignity, how to defend human rights. promoted by Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. It was all very important to remind all those things. So thank you very much, and all the best for you and for your organization. Please pass greetings to all the members. You do excellent job, really fighting at this very important front line in the UN. And for those of our viewers who would like to support CFAM, we'll also post the bank account number when you can transfer your donation if you wish. So good luck in your work, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Piotr and Zbigniew, for this conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.